Lesson 10, students have the option to either use pre-made graphs of fuel consumption, CO2 emissions, and population growth. So those pre-made graphs are included in the student edition and also on handouts. But we also provided an option for students to work with some of the data themselves and make some graphs. What I'm showing you here is a reference in the student edition that can be used to help students make these graphs from scratch using the Tuva platform. So we tried to provide screenshots and really clear instructions for students because we realized that at middle schools, kids may have limited experience with line graphs and scatter plots and figuring out x-axis and y-axis. And so we were trying to make this scaffolded in a way that students could follow it. So this resource is in the student edition. We highly recommend you use it. I'm going to show you quickly how to create these graphs. So when students navigate to the blank global energy consumption graph, this is what they'll see. And they have to do a couple of things to make a line graph and look at it by source. They'll first need to go to line graph by category. So up here in the menu is all the different types of graphs that they could use. By default, they're just dots. So we're going to say line graph by category. And this changes things a bit for us. Now we want to know how energy consumption's changed over time. So we are going to drag years to the x-axis. So it gets a little funky because we're just telling the system one thing right now. So all these little data points are just lined up by year. Now we want to also know the consumption for each year to see how it changed over time. So again, year is our independent variable. We're not changing anything about the year. We just want to know the dependent variable consumption, how it changed over time. This isn't that useful. So the third thing we want to do is tell the system to code all this data by the source. So we're going to drag that to the far right column. And now it produces a nice graph for students that tells them the different sources of energy and how the consumption, the amount of that energy, has changed over time. Okay, so the second graph that they could work with and create from scratch is going to be slightly different. This one is looking at how population growth and CO2 emissions have changed over time. So in this one, they are going to do a dot graph. But we want to make sure the dual axis is turned on. I believe it's automatically turned on because you see two axes there. So again, we're going to want to look by year. So we're going to drag year. Again, it's our independent variable. I'm realizing dual axis is not turned on. You have to go to the settings tab. So over here, the little wheel, and you need to turn dual axis on. All right, so dual axis is now on. It's still a dot graph. Let me make sure that that's saved. Yep. All right. So year is our x-axis variable. And I will say population is going to be our first y-axis variable, so how population has changed over time. And notice how the second axis now appears over here in this column. So we want to compare how many people are in the world and what happened to how much carbon dioxide emissions were being put off. So we're going to drag CO2 emissions to the other axis. So now we have both population growth, which is the green dots. Notice on the axis here, it gives a green dot, and the purple squares or diamonds are CO2 emissions. So students can just look at this and hopefully see that there's a correlation with the number of people in the world and the amount of CO2 emissions. If they want to get even more, if they want to look around a little bit more, they could also code by different types of energy sources. So we allowed this feature to be turned on. So if they want to look at oil consumption as well, they can actually click and drag that and say color by attribute. And what this does is it actually shows, so instead of the green dots and the purple, it actually will show, so population is dots, CO2 is diamonds, and now it also shows how oil consumption also changed over time. So you can see oil consumption really went up about the 1960s. If you wanted to look at a different type of energy source, you could swap it out and say, what about coal? Let's see what happened to coal consumption. Oh, yep, definitely coal. Coal may have started a little bit earlier, really jumping up in consumption. And you can see that definitely a little bit in the 1900s. So this is just another way that students can visualize the data. It's not necessary for the lesson, but we wanted to give students the option to explore. So finally, before I wrap up the video, I just want to let you know there's a few other features that students can do. They can take screenshots of the graphs they make and put them into virtual learning spaces or onto handouts. And then there's also this little pen icon. Students can actually annotate the graph itself. So if they wanted to like point out like a big inflection point here where things really went up, they could. So they can annotate the graph and then also take a screenshot.